I'm borrowing money from my parents.
Right.
I know so many fighters that are living in the Jackson's MMA gym because they can't afford to have their own.
Let me first understand what we have here. This is a transcript from a UFC fighter pay expose video. I need to maintain the exact paragraph structure while expanding and making it more engaging for TTS.
I'm getting less now for the UFC than I did for some of my Cage Warriors fights.
So UFC fighters are finally exposing the brutal truth about their pay, and let me tell you, it's absolutely not looking good at all. Veterans and hungry newcomers alike are sharing their stories, and these accounts are raising some seriously disturbing questions that the UFC never wanted anyone to ask. And Dana White's reaction? It's making everything even worse than you could possibly imagine. Let me break this whole situation down for you piece by piece, because what's happening behind the scenes is genuinely shocking.
When we hear that guys have to have a part-time job or this and that while they're fighting, you know, there's like lopsidedness there.
The Empire's dirty secret is something most fans never actually see with their own eyes. Picture this scene for a moment. The lights are blazing bright enough to completely blind you. The crowd is roaring with an intensity that literally shakes the arena walls to their foundation. And you're sitting there thinking to yourself that these guys must absolutely be living the dream, right? $1 million paydays every few months, fancy sports cars in every color imaginable, mansions, the whole 9 yards and then some. But here's the brutal, unfiltered reality that the Ultimate Fighting Championship desperately doesn't want you to truly understand or even think about. That fighter you just watched get his face absolutely caved in during the preliminary card. He's probably going home tonight with less money in his pocket than you made this month sitting at your comfortable desk job, answering emails and attending Zoom meetings. I'm not exaggerating even slightly when I tell you this disturbing fact.
All of a sudden, someone is betting a tremendous amount of money on him to lose in the first round, and the guy he's fighting has never stopped a single opponent in his entire UFC career.
You heard that right, and this is gonna blow your mind. Fighters are literally taking pay cuts to join the UFC. We're talking about the biggest MMA organization on the entire planet, the most prestigious fighting promotion in the world, and athletes are actually earning less money than they did competing in smaller regional promotions just for the privilege of fighting there. Entry-level UFC fighters typically earn $12,000 to show and $12,000 to win per fight, which sounds decent on paper until you dig deeper. They're often netting far less after expenses, taxes, and team deductions, sometimes walking away with as little as $5,000 to $10,000 per bout. Let that sink in for a moment, really let it marinate in your mind. These are professional athletes competing at the absolute highest level of mixed martial arts on the entire planet, and they're walking away with what amounts to pocket change after everybody else takes their cut. Managers get 10 to 20% right off the top before the fighter sees a dime. Coaches get another 10 to 15% for their training services. Then Uncle Sam comes knocking at the door for his substantial share through taxes. Training camps alone can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 per fight, just to prepare properly for 3 rounds of combat. So when you actually do the math on that $24,000 payday for showing up and winning, it evaporates faster than a jab thrown in the first round of a championship bout.
Somehow, those guys never went to jail, never went to prison, and they broke up glory.
But surely, you might be thinking to yourself, the UFC treats its athletes well overall, right? I mean, we're talking about a company valued at over $12 billion at this point in time. Dana White himself is worth somewhere north of $500 million by most conservative estimates that analysts have calculated. You guys are different. There's no other people on earth like you. World Championship football player, World Championship basketball player. It's not the same. Different. Special. Unique. That's what Dana White tells his fighters when they ask about compensation. But when it comes to actually paying them fairly, well, let me introduce you to a little document that the UFC absolutely never wanted to see the light of day. Back in 2012, Lorenzo Fertitta, who was running the UFC at the time as its primary owner and decision maker, went on ESPN and made a remarkably bold claim to the viewing public. He stated that the UFC's revenue share to fighters was not far off from what the other major sports leagues pay as a percentage of total revenue generated. Sounds reasonable enough on the surface, right? The NBA gives players around 50% of revenue generated by the league. The NFL sits at about 48% by most calculations that financial experts have done. But here's where things get genuinely interesting and quite revealing about the UFC's true nature. That statement caused such an immediate and fierce backlash from media and fans that Fertitta actually commissioned a comprehensive study the following year to settle the debate once and for all. He paid a consulting firm called Mercer somewhere between $45,000 and $50,000 to analyze exactly how UFC fighter pay stacked up against other professional sports organizations across the board. And the results of this extensive analysis, they were absolutely damning beyond what anyone could have expected or predicted. The study found that UFC fighters received just 18.6% of total revenue generated by their performances. This was far below Major League Soccer at 76%, boxing at 62.5%, or team leagues like the NBA at 50% and the NFL at 48%. Read that again and let it truly register in your mind, 18.6%. While soccer players in MLS are taking home 76% of the revenue they help generate through their athletic performances, UFC fighters are scraping by on less than a fifth of what they bring in through their blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Boxers get more than 3 times the revenue share that mixed martial artists receive for doing similar work and taking similar risks. And what did the UFC do with this damning information that completely contradicted their public statement? Did they announce sweeping reforms to address the disparity? Did they increase fighter pay to something even remotely resembling fairness or industry standards? Of course not, because that would require actually caring about the athletes who built their empire. A pre-2016 sale investor presentation revealed they capped future fighter shares at 20% specifically to maintain profit margins for ownership. The UFC literally used this comprehensive study to figure out how to keep fighter pay as low as humanly possible while still attracting wealthy investors and maintaining their monopolistic control. They weren't looking for opportunities to help their athletes live better lives or achieve financial security. They were looking for ways to maximize profits at the direct expense of the men and women who bleed for their entertainment every single weekend. Now you might be wondering how the UFC gets away with this systematic exploitation year after year. After all, wouldn't fighters just go somewhere else if the pay was so terrible compared to other options? And that brings us to one of the dirtiest aspects of this entire operation that nobody talks about in mainstream MMA media. The UFC created what economists call a monopsony, which is a market dominated by one buyer, allowing them to dictate terms to everyone else. See, when Zuffa LLC bought the UFC back in 2001 for just $2 million, they immediately started buying up all the competition systematically and methodically. Pride FC in Japan was purchased and absorbed completely. Strikeforce was swallowed whole with all their top 10. UFC was eliminated entirely from the landscape. Every single rival organization that could have given fighters an alternative place to work and negotiate better pay got eaten up by the UFC machine, piece by piece. And when you're the only game in town, the only path to making a living as a professional mixed martial artist, you can pay whatever you want. Fighters have exactly 2 choices available to them: accept the UFC's terms regardless of how unfair they are, or don't fight professionally at all and find another career.
If either fighter wins by submission in the first 3 minutes of round 1, 25-1. Can anybody do the math on that? If you bet $100,000 on that, 2.5 million.
The contracts themselves are specifically designed to trap athletes in this exploitative system for as long as possible. Fighters are bound by exclusive long-term deals that severely limit opportunities elsewhere. They're classified as independent contractors without any employee benefits like health insurance, and the agreements include clauses that cap earnings potential and control ancillary rights like sponsorships and appearances. These aren't just standard employment agreements that you'd see in other sports. They're economic cages designed to control every single aspect of a fighter's earning potential throughout their entire career. Fighters sign on for 4 to 8 fights spread over multiple years, during which time they can't compete anywhere else in the world. They can't negotiate individual sponsorship deals on their own terms. If you become champion, your contract automatically extends, binding you to the UFC for even longer without any opportunity for renegotiation. This is exactly why someone like Francis Ngannou, one of the most devastating knockout artists in heavyweight history, eventually walked away from the organization entirely despite being the champion. The former heavyweight champion made millions in boxing post-UFC because he finally had the leverage to negotiate his true market value elsewhere. But most fighters don't have that kind of name recognition or crossover appeal available to them. Most fighters are completely stuck with nowhere to go, and the numbers paint an incredibly grim picture of just how stuck they really are in this system. The median annual salary hovers around $51,000, with 43% of fighters earning under $45,000 yearly before any expenses. Think about that for a second and let it truly sink into your understanding. Nearly half of all UFC fighters make less than $45,000 a year before they pay for training, coaching, medical expenses, and travel costs. These are elite athletes who train 6 days a week without breaks, who risk permanent brain damage and broken bones every single time they step into the octagon, and they're making less than the median American household income. But meanwhile, Dana White is out there gambling $30 million like it's pocket change that fell out of his sofa cushion. UFC President Dana White's personal wealth and gambling losses have become a major point of contention among fans and critics, with many people highlighting the stark contrast between his lavish lifestyle and the financial struggles of entry-level fighters who built his empire. But here's where things get even more disturbing than you could possibly imagine, because when you have fighters this desperate for money, when you have elite athletes who can barely pay their rent despite competing at the highest level of their sport, that's when the vultures start circling overhead with offers that are hard to refuse.
I'm also pay fighters more, you know? And I know Dana's running a business and he's a great businessman.
That's for him.
The shadow market represents one of the darkest aspects of this whole situation. If there's one thing that desperate people are particularly vulnerable to, it's offers that seem too good to be true. And in the world of UFC, where fighters are struggling every single day to keep the lights on despite putting their bodies on the line night after night, those offers have started coming from some very dark and dangerous places that operate in the shadows. Let me tell you about something that happened at the end of 2024 that sent absolute shockwaves through the entire mixed martial arts community worldwide and beyond. A fighter named Isaac Dulgarian stepped into the Octagon for what should have been a routine undercard bout that nobody would remember a week later. But something was very wrong from the opening bell. This was a guy known throughout the MMA community for being an incredible grappler with supernatural ground skills, someone who could control opponents on the ground with seemingly otherworldly ability that most fighters only dream about developing. Yet somehow, inexplicably, he failed to complete a takedown where he was in perfect position to complete the takedown easily. And then when he ended up with his opponent on his back, he suddenly didn't remember how to defend basic chokes that he'd been defending since he was a white belt. The fight ended in the first round by rear naked choke in the most suspicious fashion imaginable. And almost immediately alarm bells started ringing throughout the sports betting world. Literally, the first thing we did was call the FBI. That's Dana White himself, describing what happened after the suspicious betting patterns were flagged by US Integrity 360, the company that monitors gambling activity for the UFC organization and reports anomalies. Federal agents will now comb through every single layer of the UFC ecosystem, including referees, judges, matchmakers, and managers, to determine whether any non-fighter personnel may have benefited from manipulated outcome. The FBI is literally investigating whether UFC fights are being fixed for gambling purposes by organized crime or betting syndicates. Let that settle in for a moment, and consider the implications for the sport's integrity. And this isn't an isolated incident by any means whatsoever. This is part of a disturbing pattern that dates back years and involves multiple gyms and fighters. Remember the James Krause scandal that rocked the MMA world? Back in the early 2020s, a massive betting operation was uncovered involving fighters, coaches, and team members at a gym called Glory MMA in Kansas City. A fighter named Derek Minner went into a fight as a heavy favorite with the betting public, and suddenly someone started betting enormous amounts of money on him to lose in the first round by knockout specifically. The problem with this scenario, his opponent had literally never stopped a single opponent in his entire UFC career up to that point in time.
You shouldn't be in the top 10 having to fucking work at Walmart or something.
The fight played out exactly as the suspicious bets had predicted it would, like a script being followed to the letter. Minner threw a low kick, immediately appeared injured beyond belief, threw another kick with the same supposedly injured leg, went down dramatically like he'd been shot, and got stopped by the referee. The whole team got disbanded afterward and multiple people were banned. People got permanently banned from the UFC for life. But here's the thing that should keep every MMA fan up at night thinking about the sport's integrity. Nobody went to jail for any of it despite clear evidence of fight fixing.
My parents.
Right.
I know so many fighters that are living in the Jackson's MMA gym because they can't afford to have their own apartment. And they're UFC fighters.
And now, according to multiple credible reports from investigative journalists, similar suspicious activity might be happening all over again throughout the sport. Because when fighters are making just $12,000 to show up and potentially walk away with less than $5,000 after expenses and taxes, a six-figure offer to take a dive starts looking very attractive indeed. Let's break down the mathematics of temptation here so you understand the scale of what we're dealing with.
These sports, world leaders, they're all watching you. You guys are different than any other athlete on the
$2.5 million from a single bet placed with inside knowledge. That's what someone can potentially win if they know exactly how a fight is going to end beforehand. And what do they need to make that happen? Just one desperate fighter willing to accept a fraction of that windfall in exchange for losing convincingly on camera. Low pay directly correlates with increased suspicions of fixed fights, as evidenced by recent cases that have come to light. The UFC has inadvertently created the perfect conditions for corruption to thrive and spread throughout their organization. They've suppressed fighter wages to the absolute minimum possible while maximizing profits, eliminated any meaningful competition that might offer better pay elsewhere, and built a system where athletes have absolutely no safety net if they get injured or go on a losing streak. And when fighters speak out about any of this publicly or try to organize for better conditions, they get shut down immediately and sometimes punished. Jorge Masvidal, one of the biggest stars in UFC history with millions of fans worldwide, had to carefully couch his criticism of fighter pay in compliments to Dana White, because everyone in the sport knows exactly what happens to fighters who rock the boat too hard or speak too honestly. We're talking about top 10 fighters in the world, elite athletes who should be living comfortably. working at Walmart between training sessions just to pay their bills. This is the brutal reality of the UFC in 2025, and Jon Jones, arguably the greatest mixed martial artist of all time, has seen this harsh reality firsthand with his own A's throughout his career. These aren't amateur prospects hoping to make it big someday in the distant future when their skills develop. These are contracted UFC athletes. People who have already made it to the highest level of the sport and should be financially secure, sleeping in gyms because they can't afford rent in their own city. The question becomes, how did we get here exactly? How did a sport that generates billions of dollars every single year end up treating its world-class athletes worse than minor league baseball treats its developing players? The answer lies in the UFC's early history and the deliberate choices made by its leadership over the past 2 decades of growth. In the early 2000s, base purses for preliminary card fighters were as low as $2,000 or $5,000, with win bonuses matching or doubling that amount. From the very beginning of the modern UFC era, the organization treated fighter pay as something to be minimized rather than celebrated or prioritized as an investment in talent. And as the organization grew from a $2 million purchase into a multi-billion-dollar entertainment empire, that fundamental philosophy never changed one bit. The Reebok deal in 2015 made things even worse for struggling fighters trying to make ends meet. Previously, fighters could earn significant money from individual sponsorships displayed on their shorts and banners during fights. The 2015 Reebok deal, later replaced by the Venom deal, replaced individual sponsorships with tiered payouts ranging from $4,000 for newcomers to $40,000 for champions, dramatically reducing external income opportunity. Overnight, fighters lost one of their most important revenue streams completely without any input or negotiation. A mid-tier fighter who might have been making $50,000 a year from various sponsorships suddenly had to survive on whatever the UFC decided to give them. Gray Maynard, a former lightweight title challenger who fought the biggest names in the sport, earned around $40,000 for high-stakes title bouts, prompting him to liken UFC fighters to strippers getting tipped by customers. And what does Dana White say when confronted with all of this overwhelming evidence? What's his response to the clear proof that his organization systematically underpays the athletes who make the entire enterprise possible? He tells fighters how special they are, how unique and irreplaceable, how nobody else on earth is quite like them, while refusing to pay them accordingly. Empty praise. Instead of fair pay, that's been the UFC's primary strategy for 2 decades running, but the tide might finally be turning at long last. The reckoning has begun. After years of systematic exploitation and enforced silence, something remarkable finally happened in 2025 that changed everything. A $375 million antitrust settlement was reached, covering approximately 2,000 fighters, with individual payments ranging from $5,000 minimums to over $1 million for 35 athletes who were most affected. $375 million. That's what the UFC had to pay after a decade-long legal battle over their treatment of fighters and monopolistic business practices. The lawsuit, known as Lee versus Zuffa, argued that the UFC had illegally suppressed wages through their monopolistic practices for years, and the federal courts agreed with the fighters completely. The average payout per claimant was approximately $220,000, finally providing some meaningful financial relief to fighters who had been systematically underpaid for years without any recourse or alternative. For some fighters, it was genuinely life-changing money that transformed their circumstances overnight and allowed them to pay off debts or invest in their futures. For others, it was validation that what they had experienced wasn't just bad luck or poor negotiating skills on their part. It was a system designed from the ground up to exploit them systematically. Rampage Jackson celebrated the settlement as an early Christmas gift from the legal system. But here's the thing about legal settlements that people need to understand clearly. They're not admissions of guilt by the defendant, they're not promises to change business practices going forward, and they're just the cost of doing business for a company as wealthy as TKO Group Holdings. And the numbers show that very little has actually changed in the day-to-day reality for current fighters. By 2025, average fighter salaries range from $152,000 to $228,000 annually, but the median figures of $51,370 to $21,250 reveal extreme skewness in the data. 43% of fighters still earn below $45,000 before deductions for training, management, and taxes. The same structural problems persist year after year without meaningful reform. Entry-level fighters still make $12,000 to show regardless of the settlement. Revenue sharing still hovers around 15 to 20% of total organizational income. The monopsony power that allows the UFC to dictate terms to fighters hasn't been broken in any meaningful way by the legal system. In fact, the UFC just signed a massive new television deal that should have been an absolute game-changer for fighter compensation across the board. A new $7.7 billion TV deal with Paramount and CBS was announced, effectively doubling annual revenue to approximately $1.1 billion per year. $7.7 billion over the life of the contract. That's an astronomical sum of money flowing into the UFC's coffers every single year for the next decade. And what did Dana White promise fighters would see from this massive windfall of television money? White vaguely assured that benefits would trickle down, saying, "I can't sit here right now and tell you it's double, it's 1.5, it's triple, but yeah, fighter pay is gonna be good." Trickle-down economics for professional athletes. That's literally the best the UFC is willing to offer the people who built their multi-billion-dollar empire with their blood and sacrifice. Meanwhile, Jake Paul of all people has emerged as one of the loudest and most persistent advocates for fighter pay reform in the entire sport, which is both inspiring and depressing simultaneously. Jake Paul has consistently pushed for specific reforms like raising UFC minimum fighter pay from $12,000 to $50,000 per fight, providing 50% revenue sharing similar to other major sports, and offering long-term healthcare for fighters dealing with injury. Say what you want about Jake Paul as a boxer or as a public personality, but his demands aren't unreasonable by any stretch of the imagination. $50,000 minimum per fight for athletes competing at the highest level of their sport. That should be a baseline expectation, not a stretch goal that seems impossible. Paul has promised to shut up about the issue if White raises minimum pay to $50,000. But Dana White isn't interested in compromise or negotiation. He's never been interested in sharing more than the absolute minimum required by law. White has stated, "This is mine and this is the way we're doing it." 4 simple words that sum up everything wrong with UFC fighter compensation today. The organization isn't a partnership between athletes and management working toward common goals. It's Dana White's personal fiefdom, and fighters are just the labor that keeps the money-making machine running smoothly. The real tragedy is that fighters themselves have struggled repeatedly to organize and fight back effectively against these conditions. Union efforts have failed time and again, with fighters like Sean Strickland calling pay garbage and advocating for raises, while others highlight similar issues in other promotions as well. Multiple attempts at forming a fighters union have collapsed over the years without achieving anything meaningful for the athletes. The Professional Fighters Association launched in 2016 with great fanfare and went absolutely nowhere despite initial enthusiasm. Project Spearhead collected union cards in 2018 but faced National Labor Relations Board hurdles that proved insurmountable under current labor law. Fighters are classified as independent contractors rather than employees, which severely limits legal protections and makes unionization extremely difficult under existing federal regulation. And the UFC has made it crystal clear what happens to fighters who push too hard for collective action or speak too honestly about working conditions. Leslie Smith was allegedly released in 2018 after pushing aggressively for collective bargaining rights, sending a clear message to other fighters. The message is unmistakable: fall in line and accept what you're given, or find yourself without a job in the only organization that matters for your career. But here's what gives me genuine hope for the future of fighter compensation. The conversation is changing rapidly in ways that benefit athletes. The antitrust settlement has put a permanent spotlight on UFC's thinnest practices that they can't easily escape or ignore. Jake Paul's advocacy, however self-serving it might appear on the surface, has kept fighter pay in the public consciousness consistently. Social media has given athletes a direct platform to share their struggles with fans who actually care about their well-being. Recent polls show overwhelming public sentiment questioning whether UFC pay crosses the line into exploitation of world-class athletes. People are starting to understand that the UFC's massive success comes at a tremendous human cost that shouldn't be acceptable. The highlights they watch on YouTube are produced by athletes who often can't afford basic healthcare for themselves or their families. The knockouts they cheer for are delivered by men and women who might go home to empty refrigerators and unpaid bills despite entertaining millions. John Jones talking about being willing to sacrifice years of his prime career just to bring attention to fighter pay issues. That's powerful testimony. One of the greatest competitors in the history of combat sports willing to walk away from championship fights and legacy-defining moments just to help the next generation of athletes earn a living wage. More than winning belts or breaking records, that's what he believes his ultimate legacy should be. Not the highlight reel knockouts that go viral on social media, not the championship defenses that fill arenas and generate pay-per-view revenue, but standing up for fighters who don't have the platform or the leverage to stand up for themselves effectively. The UFC is at a crossroads that will define the sport for generations of fighters to come. They've built an incredible entertainment product that generates billions of dollars in revenue and captivates audiences around the world every single weekend. But they've accomplished this by systematically exploiting the very athletes who make it all possible through their talent and sacrifice. The question now is whether fans, media, and lawmakers will continue to let them get away with it indefinitely, or if real change is finally come. Because at the end of the day, this isn't really about Dana White's gambling losses or Jake Paul's social media feuds or celebrity boxing matches. It's about the fighter who just won their UFC debut and still can't make rent this month despite achieving their lifelong dream. It's about the veteran dealing with brain damage who never received proper health insurance coverage during their career. It's about the young prospects sleeping in a gym because following their dream meant choosing between proper training and having a place to live. These are real people making real sacrifices every single day for our entertainment. and they deserve so much better than 18% of the revenue they generate through their blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They deserve better than trickle-down promises from billionaires who gamble more in a weekend than most fighters make in a year. They deserve a fair wage for fair work, plain and simple, and the only question left is whether anyone in power will ever actually listen to their voices and act accordingly. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this that expose the truth behind professional sport.